The rivalry between Will Spencer and RJ Forrester did not begin with open hostility. It began with comparison, then discomfort, then quiet resentment that neither of them fully admitted to themselves until it had already taken root. For a time, Forrester Creations had been the one place where both young men existed under the same ceiling of expectation. Not as equals, exactly, but as heirs of two different legacies trying to define themselves in a shared industry built on beauty, power, and inherited ambition. And when the position of Senior Creative Operations Manager opened, a role that sat uncomfortably close to both creative authority and corporate influence, something in the structure of their coexistence snapped into sharper focus. Suddenly, everything became a measure. Experience versus entitlement. Vision versus legacy. Connection versus inheritance. RJ approached it with quiet confidence, the kind that came from growing up inside the system. He understood the rhythm of Forrester Creations the way someone understands breathing, instinctively, without needing to articulate it. Will approached it differently, like someone trying to prove he did not need what he had been born into. That difference alone would have been enough to create tension. But what turned tension into rupture was Electra Forrester. Electra had become, without intention or permission, a gravitational point between them. Not because she chose to be, but because both men interpreted her presence differently depending on what they needed from her at any given moment. To RJ, she represented continuity, familiarity, a shared understanding of the emotional weight that came with life inside the Forrester world. To Will, she represented stability after chaos, a chance to rebuild trust where everything else had fractured. And Electra, caught between those interpretations, found herself navigating emotional terrain that was constantly shifting beneath her feet. It was during one of those fragile attempts at reconciliation with Will that everything changed. The studio was nearly empty that evening. Late light filtered through the glass walls of Forrester Creations, casting long, distorted shadows across unfinished designs and scattered fabric samples. The building felt quieter than usual, as though even the space itself was aware of the emotional instability moving through it. Electra and Will stood close to each other near the design table, not touching, not fully apart, suspended in that uncertain space where reconciliation is still possible but no longer guaranteed. "I want this to work," Will said quietly. Electra nodded slightly. "So do I," she replied. But neither of them fully believed in the simplicity of those words anymore, because belief had been worn thin by too many interruptions, too many fractures, too many truths arriving at the wrong time. And then RJ appeared. He did not enter loudly. He did not interrupt. He simply stepped into the space as if he belonged there, and in many ways, he did. His eyes moved first to Electra, then to Will, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, not hostility, something more contained. Recognition of emotional geometry that no longer aligned cleanly. "I didn't realize you were still here," RJ said. Electra turned slightly. "We were just talking," she replied. Will's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing, because silence, in that moment, felt like control. RJ nodded once. Then his gaze lingered on Electra just a fraction too long. And that fraction was enough. The kiss happened quickly, not dramatically, not intentionally theatrical, but in the kind of emotional proximity that occurs when unresolved tension collapses distance faster than logic can intervene. It was brief, unexpected, and entirely catastrophic in its consequences. Electra stepped back immediately afterward, her expression shifting instantly into shock and realization. RJ looked just as startled, but Will had already seen enough. He did not move at first, because rage, when it first arrives, does not always demand motion. Sometimes it demands processing. But what Will was processing was not just the kiss. It was the timeline of meaning behind it, the fragile attempt at reconciliation, the proximity, the overlap of emotional spaces he had believed were being repaired. All of it restructured in an instant into something else entirely. Deception, or at least perceived deception. When Will finally moved, it was not toward Electra. It was toward RJ. Fast, direct, without hesitation. The impact of his fist against RJ's jaw echoed through the studio with a force that silenced every remaining trace of ambient noise in the building. RJ stumbled backward, catching himself against the edge of a table, shock replacing composure in real time. "What the hell?" he started. But Will was already moving again. And this time, security had to intervene. By the time Ridge Forrester entered the room, the damage was no longer physical alone. It was reputational, emotional, structural. Executives had already begun to gather. Whispers spread quickly through the building. A Spencer attacking a Forrester. A romantic entanglement collapsing into corporate instability. And beneath all of it, something far more dangerous. Escalation between two legacy heirs whose personal conflict now threatened professional order. Ridge stepped between them immediately. "This stops now," he said firmly. But Will was breathing heavily, eyes locked on RJ with a focus that suggested this was no longer about a single moment. It was about accumulation. "You think this is about a kiss?" Will said sharply. Electra looked at him, stunned. RJ wiped blood from his lips slowly. "What else would it be?" RJ asked. Will's expression hardened. "It's about everything leading up to it," he said. And in that moment, something inside him clarified fully. Not resolution, but direction. Later that night, Will stood alone in his office. The building had quieted, but his mind had not. He replayed everything, not emotionally, but structurally. The instability with Electra, the patterns of proximity between her and RJ, the timing of emotional ruptures coinciding with professional ambition, and the kiss. That single event that had not created the conflict, but revealed its existence in full clarity. And what he realized was no longer personal. It was systemic. RJ was not just a rival in romance. He was embedded within the same institutional structure that had allowed emotional instability to interfere with professional hierarchy. And Forrester Creations, in Will's current interpretation, was no longer just a workplace. It was a battleground for influence. The decision did not feel sudden when it came. It felt inevitable. He called Bill Spencer late that night. Bill answered immediately. "That sounds serious," Bill said after listening to the summary. "It is," Will replied. A pause. Then Bill spoke again. "You don't win battles like that from inside the enemy's structure," he said calmly. Will understood immediately what that meant. Silence followed. Then Will said it. "I'm coming back." When the announcement became official, it sent immediate shockwaves through both Forrester Creations and Spencer Enterprises. Well, Spencer was leaving Forrester. Not quietly, not gradually, but decisively. And more than that, he was returning to his father's company, not as a passive executive, but as an active participant in strategy, in restructuring, in expansion, in competition. What no one said aloud yet, but everyone understood immediately, was that this was no longer about employment. It was alignment of power. RJ learned about it in a meeting. Electra learned about it moments later. And Ridge learned about it in silence that lasted longer than any spoken reaction could have expressed. Because everyone understood the implication. This was not withdrawal. This was escalation. Electra tried to reach Will that night, but he did not answer. Not because he was avoiding her emotionally, but because he was no longer operating within the same framework of relationship she was attempting to access. When it finally spoke the next morning, it was brief, controlled, detached. "You're really doing this?" she asked. Will looked at her without hesitation. "Yes," he said. Electra's voice softened slightly. "Because of RJ?" Will shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "Because I understand where I am now." She frowned slightly. "And where is that?" Will's answer came without emotion. Opposition. What began as emotional fracture between individuals had now evolved into structural division between institutions. Spencer Enterprises versus Forrester Creations. Father versus family legacy. Son versus inherited identity. And at the center of it all, relationships that had once felt personal now becoming collateral in a much larger conflict. Bill Spencer understood immediately what this meant. When Will walked into his office, Bill did not ask about feelings. He asked about intent. "You ready for this?" he said simply. Will nodded once. "Yes." Bill leaned back slightly. "Good," he said. "Then we stop pretending this is about anything other than control." And somewhere across the city, RJ stood in the same building where everything had begun to unravel, realizing that the kiss, brief, impulsive, misunderstood, had already been absorbed into something far larger than personal consequence. Electra stood beside him, silent. And Ridge, watching the fracture lines spreading through both companies, understood what was coming next. Not reconciliation, not repair, but escalation. Because when love collapses inside systems built on power, it does not end quietly. It reorganizes into war. The moment Will Spencer walked out of Forrester Creations for the last time as an employee, something irreversible settled into the atmosphere of Los Angeles fashion's elite circle. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was structural. A shift in power that did not announce itself with spectacle, but with absence. Because sometimes the most dangerous moves are not the ones that happen inside a room, but the ones that remove someone from it entirely. RJ felt it first in the silence of the design floor. Electra felt it in the way people stopped speaking freely around her. Ridge felt it in the way contracts suddenly seemed less stable than they had the day before. And Bill simply smiled when he saw his son walk into Spencer Enterprises that morning, as if a long-awaited alignment had finally clicked into place. "You look like me when I stopped asking permission," Bill said. Will didn't smile back. "I'm not here to look like you," he replied. Bill raised an eyebrow slightly. "Good," he said. "Then we're going to win faster." The first phase of Will's return was not aggressive. It was quiet acquisition. He did not storm into meetings demanding control. He observed. He learned the internal fractures of Spencer Enterprises that even Bill had stopped noticing. Departments operating on habit rather than efficiency, legacy partnerships maintained out of sentiment rather than strategy, and most importantly, gaps in Forrester's market positioning that had never been fully exploited. And Will understood something very quickly. Forrester Creations was emotionally powerful. Spencer Enterprises was structurally powerful. And structure always outlasts emotion. RJ, meanwhile, tried to stabilize the situation from inside Forrester. But stability was no longer an option. Every interaction with Electra now carried invisible weight. Not because of lingering romance, but because of implication. The kiss had not just damaged trust between three people. It had infected perception across the entire company. Design meetings became quieter. Executive decisions were second-guessed. Even Ridge, who had seen decades of internal conflict, found himself recalibrating how much influence RJ and Electra should be allowed near each other. And RJ felt it. The slow isolation. Not formal, not declared, but real. Electra was the one who began unraveling first. Not publicly, privately. Because she could no longer determine where responsibility ended and manipulation began. She replayed every interaction with Will, every conversation with RJ, every moment where emotional proximity had blurred professional consequence. And the more she analyzed it, the less certain she became of her own innocence and how everything had escalated. One evening, she finally confronted RJ alone. "I didn't mean for any of this," she said quietly. RJ looked at her for a long moment before responding. "I know," he said, but that answer did not comfort her, because knowing intent did not erase consequence. Across the city, Will began executing his first real move. It came in the form of a strategic leak. Not financial, not corporate espionage in the traditional sense, but perception-based disruption. A carefully structured piece of industry information suggesting instability within Forrester Creations' upcoming international expansion line. It was subtle enough to avoid direct accusation, but powerful enough to shift investor confidence. And within 48 hours, Forrester stock projections wavered. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Ridge called an emergency meeting. RJ was present. Electra was present. So was Steffi. And when Ridge placed the report on the table, the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. This didn't come from inside, Ridge said. Steffi frowned. Then where did it come from? Ridge hesitated for a fraction of a second. Spencer Enterprises. Silence followed. RJ's expression hardened. That's not a coincidence, he said. Ridge nodded slowly. No, he replied. It's a message. Electra felt something cold settle in her chest at that word. Message. Because messages are never neutral. They always imply intent. And intent always implies continuation. Meanwhile, Will sat in Bill Spencer's office watching the same market response unfold on multiple screens. Bill leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied. First ripple, he said. Wood didn't take his eyes off the data. This isn't enough, he said quietly. Bill studied him for a moment. No, Bill agreed. It's not. A pause. Then Bill smiled slightly. But it's enough to make them look. And that was the real strategy. Attention disruption. Because once a competitor starts looking in the wrong direction, they stop seeing the structure being built underneath them. RJ was the first to notice something deeper. Not the leak itself, but the pattern behind it. He started reviewing internal systems, tracing anomalies, mapping influence shifts across supplier networks and media channels. And slowly, reluctantly, he began to see it. This was not random retaliation. It was coordinated positioning. Someone inside Spencer Enterprises was learning Forrester Creations faster than Forrester Creations was adapting to Spencer Enterprises. And that someone was Will. When RJ told Ridge, the reaction was immediate tension. Are you sure? Ridge asked. RJ hesitated. No, he admitted, but I'm starting to see structure where there shouldn't be chaos. That sentence lingered in the room longer than anything else. Because structure inside conflict means intent. And intent means escalation is no longer accidental. Electra, caught between both worlds, began withdrawing emotionally. Not from guilt, but from overload. She stopped attending optional meetings. She stopped responding to non-essential messages. And most noticeably, she stopped trying to interpret Will's behavior through emotional lens. Because every attempt to understand him emotionally only deepened her confusion. And confusion, over time, becomes exhaustion. Will noticed her distance immediately, but he did not interpret it as loss. He interpreted it as transition. Because in his current framework, emotional separation was not rupture. It was repositioning, and repositioning in business warfare is normal. The next escalation came unexpectedly. A joint supplier that both companies had quietly depended on for years suddenly terminated its contract with Forrester Creations. The official reason was vague. Strategic restructuring. But RJ knew better. The timing was too precise. The alignment too clean. This was not coincidence. This was removal. Ridge slammed his hand on the table when he heard. This is Will, he said immediately. Electra looked up sharply. RJ didn't argue. Because for the first time, he didn't have a counter-argument. Only recognition. That night, RJ confronted Will. Not in an office. Not through intermediaries. But directly at a neutral location neither company controlled. They stood across from each other in a quiet rooftop parking structure overlooking the city. The wind was sharp. The distance between them felt intentional. You're dismantling us piece by piece, RJ said. Will tilted his head slightly. I'm responding to structure, he replied. RJ laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You call this structure? He asked. This is revenge. Will didn't react emotionally. That's your interpretation, he said. RJ stepped forward slightly. You're destroying Electra in the process. That landed differently. Not because it was untrue, but because it introduced a variable Will had been categorizing differently until now. Will paused, then said quietly, She's not collateral. RJ narrowed his eyes. Then what is she? A long silence. And for the first time, Wood did not respond immediately. Because the answer was no longer simple. Not even to him. Somewhere across the city, Electra stood alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection in a darkened window. She no longer recognized the structure forming around her life. Not love, Not loyalty, but alignment of competing systems that were beginning to consume everything personal inside them. And for the first time, she understood something terrifying. She was no longer at the center of a relationship. She was at the center of a war that had already